It sometimes seems as though Russian President Vladimir Putin wants to turn back the clock. He's been insisting that the West should provide Russia with far-reaching security guarantees or face the consequences if it doesn't. So what exactly does Moscow want, and how should the West respond? On To the Point, we ask Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Putin's backyard? Well, thanks so much for joining us here on the show, where my studio guests are Rachel Tausendfreund, editorial director at the German Marshall Fund, who thinks Russia may be willing to pay a high price to shape the future of its neighbours, but the US cannot back down. Also with us is Markus Kaim from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, who argues that in Geneva it was all about the US and Russia. If Europe doesn't get a more active role, it will simply be sidelined by the big powers. And a warm welcome too to Mikhail Bushuev from DW's Russian department. He believes the Russian wolf is at the door, so are the Western ducks going to try and sit this one out too? If so, good luck. Interesting stuff, plenty to talk about, so let's get on with it. Mikhail, you are laughing. Tell us a little bit about the ducks and the wolf. What does it all mean?
Listen, if we see it as a game, though morally it's problematic, but if we see it as a game, then we can see a huge asymmetry in the conflict between the West and Russia, where Russia is ready to raise the stakes, knowing it is a weaker player, it still has skin in the game and is ready for action, while the West is not. And that's the huge difference between them. So the problem is, I don't see in the moment any idea to stop Putin from doing what he's planning to do.
Rachel, what have you got to say about that? Who is threatening who from your perspective?
I mean, the threat is definitely emanating from Russia. They have over 100,000
Who are the weakest partner, or the weaker partner,
yeah.
we have just learned.
I mean, they are the weaker partner, but they want it more. And who wants it more has strength. Also, they're not that weak. I mean, Russia wants a security guarantee. They're one of the biggest, most well-armed armies in the world. So
relatively
the idea that they
weaker,
that the idea that they need a security guarantee is farcical. But they're the aggressors. They're the ones who want it more. The West, the US, and Europe, they would rather not have to deal with this issue. This is not number one, not number two, not number three on their list until Russia makes it. And that's an asymmetry, indeed.
So, Markus Kaim, I'd be interested to know what you have to say about this, about who's to blame for taking us to the edge of a conflict that a leading German newspaper said could pose a threat both to Europe's security architecture and the international order. How bad is it?
It's really bad, and regardless of the situation in Ukraine and the efforts to contain the crisis in Ukraine, I think the overarching effort of the Russian leadership to reframe the European security architecture, or to redefine the European security architecture, are of even bigger concern for the Europeans, because that really turns back the clock back to the beginning of the 1990s. We have to keep in mind, with the Charter of Paris in 1990, we agreed on the fact that every country in Europe is entitled to choose the political or military alliance it wants to belong to. And if we would agree with the Russians that this is not acceptable anymore, if we would accept spheres of influence, spheres of interest in Europe, that would be more or less the division of Europe like Yalta after the end of the Cold War.
Rachel, I mean, we talk about who's provoking here, who is to blame. I picked up a line from US Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who was quoted as saying, NATO didn't promise not to grow. That sounds as though he still has a considerable appetite for expansion and enlargement. That can't put Vladimir Putin's mind at rest, surely.
I mean, it's not that the US or the other NATO partners want to expand or want to grow, but it's the principle that every state should be able to choose what it wants. And that's the principle that the US and NATO cannot back down from. They can't tell Ukraine, they can't tell let's say, Poland, which is actually what Putin would also want. Sorry, Poland, Russia doesn't want you in NATO, so it doesn't matter what you want. We have to listen to Russia. That's the principle that NATO absolutely cannot back down from. And it's a principle of Ukraine's choice. Ukraine has clearly said it's in the constitution now that they want to join NATO. And why do they want to join NATO? Because they feel threatened by Russia, not by NATO. So it's about dominance, right? It's not about sort of threat to Russia. It's an attack on Russian dominance of its neighbor countries. And frankly, Putin doesn't want Ukraine to be successful and to have a democratic, Western, European or NATO-based path, because that would get Russians thinking that maybe they could have a better situation. That's what it's really about.
But there's a problem, Rachel. The problem is that for the West and for NATO, the Ukraine, for example, is just a small puzzle piece, while for Russia, it's a centerpiece of let's say, strategic thinking, strategic plans. And that's what makes the difference, and that's what makes the asymmetry really in the conflict now.
I just wonder, before we move on, whether it is how easy it is to dismiss Vladimir Putin's concerns, because since 1997, the West has built a formidable arc of nations, from the Baltic republics in the north right down to Bulgaria, Romania, Albania in the south, and that is surely. It is understandable that Vladimir Putin views that as a threat, that scenario.
But it wasn't perceived as a threat by the Russian leadership at that time. And I think it's a conditional agreement and a conditional enlargement. I think with two major caveats. First, no major permanent deployment of NATO troops on the soil of those countries which have become member of NATO since then. There is a military presence, but it's on a rotating basis, and no nuclear weapons will be deployed to these countries. And as far as I can see, NATO was upholding these commitments of the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997. So actually, it's a part of a new, more recent Russian narrative, being threatened by NATO, being encircled by NATO. This is not the time, that has not been the case in the 1990s.
So why now? Why now this new narrative? What has changed?
I think it has, the Russian foreign policy has become more, to make a long story short, more revisionist, more aggressive, more focused on reconstituting some kind of post-Soviet, I wouldn't call it empire, but room of political dominance and room of political hegemony.
OK, more on that shortly. Pretty much everybody agrees that there is currently a lot at stake in relations between the US and Russia. Let's get a further feel for the uncompromising tone of the rhetoric on the two sides.
For months, Putin's menacing presence has loomed along the border with Ukraine, where 100,000 troops and heavy military equipment are reportedly being massed. Moscow has been attempting to destabilize the former Soviet republic since 2013, when protests against Ukraine's pro-Russia government resulted in the ousting of its then president. Perhaps the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, which belongs to Ukraine, was just the beginning. In any case, Russia is laying out its own directives for negotiations with NATO.
We need ironclad, waterproof, bulletproof, legally binding guarantees, not assurances, not safeguards, guarantees with all the words shall, must, everything that should be put in this bowl, never ever becoming member of NATO.
And NATO is countering.
We will never compromise on the right for every nation in Europe to choose its own path, including what kind of security arrangements it wants to be a part of.
Putin also wants to avoid the deployment of heavy military forces in Eastern Europe. Is it still possible for NATO?
Rachel Tausendfreund, given those two very oppositional positions, uncompromising positions, is rapprochement possible at this point in time, where we're experiencing new tensions and new language?
It is. I mean, in the main fundamental conflict, there is no solution. Russia wants to be able to control Ukraine, Belarus, and all of these other countries and their choices. NATO cannot shut the door, right? Both have committed to this fundamental position. There are, however, ways, right? And this is, I think, what the negotiations are working on, that one, Russia, what they're saying is a maximalist position, never ever guarantees that in Ukraine. But one could imagine some kind of compromise where it's clarified for 10 or 20 years that Ukraine has no potential for NATO membership, which is the reality in any case, right? I mean, in any case, NATO is not eager to open the doors to Ukraine while there's a low-level conflict and war going on with Russia. So the fact is, Ukraine's not joining NATO anytime soon. And maybe there's a compromise where they pick some kind of time frame that both can live with. And in a way, Russia's already winning in that it's reestablishing itself as the big European partner who's sitting at the table with the United States. This is the other thing that I think Putin wanted. You have to remember, Obama called Russia a regional power, very dismissive, was excluding Russia from different global forum as a punishment for, by the way, aggressively invading another country. So I think this is already a win for Russia because we're again taking them seriously. Washington, which wants to be only paying attention to the conflict with China, is again talking about European security, spending all of its energy on talking to Russia. So Putin's already got something out of this.
But it's only a temporary win in my eyes. I think he's not content with that, though it's a step forward. But I think in a consequence, he's seeking a recalibration of power structure in the region. So I don't buy the talks about this maximalist ultimate goals, because I don't think that's the real concern now, at least in Moscow. They want to get Ukraine back as a whole. They're not content with the Crimea and the eastern statelets. Yeah, they want more, and that's the point. And I don't see any. I don't see the West doing something in reaction that can stop him effectively.
Markus, Kaim, do you see that some have interpreted Vladimir Putin's actions in recent weeks and months as a huge kind of bluff with 100,000 soldiers in the field? Is that how you see it? And has his bluff perhaps just begun to be called in recent interactions?
No, because I never read this military exercises as a military threat. At least so far, the purpose has been more political one, to put political pressure on the West and to get something out of it. I would totally agree with Rachel. He got something out of it. He got the recognition to be one of the world leading powers, one of the superpowers or major powers, call it major powers, to negotiate on an equal level, on par with the United States, with the Biden administration. He's considered to be one of the determinants of the future European security order, in a bad way. But we have to take into consideration the Russian policies, the Russian positions, and I think he's maybe not the winner of the last couple of weeks, but he got something out of it.
Mikhail, give us a sense of how ordinary Russians are going to be responding to what we're hearing. This is a victory, I'm understanding, for Vladimir Putin. Is that how it's going to be seen by people on the street in Russia?
Well, I think people are afraid of a major war with a neighboring country. I think many people, especially elderly people, who are watching state-run TV would just believe what they are said in the media, in the state-run media. And I'm afraid that people are ready to accept the costs of war. That's a huge problem. I mean, the reason why Putin is so emboldened to let's say, take a military option and to have it, is that he knows he still can, sacrifice some prosperity in the country for the sake of greatness, etc.
Vladimir Putin it was who in 2005 said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Is that an idea that is still resonating through Russia? Is that a perception of the world that many Russians share? Because it's right at the core of who Vladimir Putin is and why he acts the way he does on the political stage, I would suggest.
Well, that's his personal opinion, but to some extent, probably yes. I don't know. We have some, you know, some social studies on that, but I don't know if we have to take it at face value. Anyway, the vision of it as a catastrophe, I don't think it's so widely accepted in the society as by Putin itself.
And it's certainly not accepted in Ukraine.
And it's right.
So I mean,
and probably in Kazakhstan and in many other countries, former Soviet countries as well. So,
so that I mean, it's not going to come easy if it's not only a bluff, and if Putin really is considering invading Ukraine, maybe also only to destabilize it or to win a few more pieces of strategic territory. It's not going to be easy because Ukrainians are quite united against Russian aggression, and they will put up a fight, although the West probably, if it were to come to it, won't help them enough.
Well, you said at the top of the show that the West must effectively respond in kind, you seem to be implying. What line should the West take if that invasion or something similar to an invasion does come?
Biden has already ruled out military intervention on behalf of Ukraine. The Europeans would have never considered it in the first place. Back in when Crimea was annexed, you had voices in the U.S. calling for a more robust military support of Ukraine, and it was the Europeans who said no. So Biden has taken a pragmatic view that this is just not something that the Europeans and the Americans will sign up to. So they have to think of other things, which are economic sanctions, as hard as they possibly can be. That seems to maybe have had some impact on Putin's thinking. But this is the asymmetry that Mikhail was talking about. I mean, Russians will put troops on the ground. They already have. Western powers won't, but they'll do as much as they can to support Ukraine. And that's the tricky thing. I mean, that's what we want to avoid that in any case. And this is what the diplomats are right now, as we speak, working on. What can they give Russia that isn't sacrificing a core principle and sacrificing Ukrainians?
And what might it be, Markus?
Actually, my concern is that during the Russian-U.S. talks on Monday, nobody was really mentioning the Minsk agreements. So we have the diplomatic and political pathways on the table, which can be followed since 2015. But nobody's ready to do this. Neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians, for different reasons, which I understand. But this is my concern. There's no political solution on the table. We have it theoretically. We have all the pieces available, but nobody's ready currently to step forward and to start a diplomatic initiative, and that has not been the agenda of the Biden administration.
I mean, it wasn't. Now they're quite active. I mean, there have been dozens of meetings, really high-level meetings. So I think now they're engaged.
Yeah.
But it does seem that they're not engaged on the terms of Minsk anymore. It's going to be something new. And that's bad news for Europeans in the sense of European ownership of the process, because Minsk was kind of a European deal. And now it looks like whatever deal happens, while the U.S. is very, very careful to include the Europeans and is actively including the Europeans, in the end, it looks like it's going to be a U.S. negotiation with Russia. And the Europeans are not the leading crafter of any kind of deal.
But I'm afraid that the ironic thing is that Minsk is dead, essentially, and that's why they even didn't mention it. That's basically also the reason why Putin is trying to say, "Oh, I'm ready for action," because Minsk is dead. So some minimal goals of the Kremlin administration are not. They haven't gotten there yet, and that's the point.
OK, let's just change the perspective a little bit and take a quick look at Russia's hasty intervention in Kazakhstan. Was this Vladimir Putin responding to the vicissitudes of international politics, or is it all part of some complex long-term strategy?
With debris cleared and the mourning of victims, an eerie calm has descended on the Kazakh megacity of Almaty. Protests were sparked by rising oil and gas prices in the resource-rich country. They are also being directed against the corrupt government, which is entangled in an internal power struggle. The authoritarian regime responded with a shoot-to-kill order. Terrorists continue to damage public and private property and use weapons against civilians. I have ordered security forces to shoot to kill without warning. Tokayev appeals to a Russian-led military alliance for support. Tanks and soldiers are keeping the peace. For Putin, this presents an opportunity to influence the situation, both externally and internally. At a military alliance video conference, he vowed to stop any color revolutions. What exactly are the Russian president's interests in Kazakhstan?
Yeah, what is Vladimir Putin up to in Kazakhstan?
I think it's part of the larger picture to recreate not a Soviet empire in a territorial sense, but to create a Russian empire in terms of hegemony, to create political influence, and using a variety of methods, which we have seen over the last couple of years, starting with cyber attacks, espionage, propaganda, over the use of ethnic Russians living in countries in the neighborhood of Russia, over using politically these low-intensity conflicts, sometimes called frozen conflicts in the Russian periphery, over destabilizing openly certain parts of the other countries, Donbass and a handful of others. So that's a Russian toolbox, but I think it all serves the same purpose to create and maintain political influence and hegemony in the post-Soviet space.
Mikhail,
I wouldn't go so far as Markus. For me, just, unexpected belated Christmas gift that Putin just took happily, but it's not a huge strategic planning of him. It just came and he took it as it came. And the thing is, there's one funny episode. Recently, Putin couldn't even pronounce the name of the Kazakhstani president properly. He just told some gibberish, and that's, for me, a sign that something different is on his mind. Not, president's name, but NATO, I don't know, Washington, Ukraine, Kiev, whatever. But that was nice. That was a possibility for him for a real show of force, to show the world, the autocrats in the region, to show Washington, okay, I've got here a military organization that is capable of something that we internally in the region were talking for years and years and years, and now it's active. Look at this. That's it. So I don't see any, bigger strategic planning behind it.
What's your worst-case scenario for the next year or two to come?
In terms of Kazakhstan, or in terms of
in terms of Vladimir Putin's continuing influence over this very, very broad region?
Well, I'm afraid that he's going to invade Ukraine by means that we don't know yet, and he's calibrating them now behind the talks in Geneva. So that's the point. That's what I'm afraid of.
Rachel,
Yeah, worst case scenario, Ukraine and the others are left alone because the Europeans and the US can't agree on anything that's strong enough to push back against it. That's a worst case scenario. I hope it won't happen. The best case scenario is a peaceful update of the post-1945 structure of European security that takes these states' sovereignty seriously, but includes Russia at the table.
Okay, and there is, at the same time as all this, there's a new German government in office. I'm just wondering what Markus's advice would be to the new German government as they contemplate this crisis.
Prepare for the worst.
Mikhail?
Optimistic.
The same. I mean, that would be a hard test for the new government and Olaf Scholz.
Do you think the new government is going to be strong enough to go head to head with the Russians, with Putin?
I don't really know, but I'm intrigued to see what they are up to and if they live up to the situation there.
Okay, we've been looking at Vladimir Putin's moves to create possibly a new post-Soviet order in East and Central Asian territories. Thanks very much for joining us. See you next time. Bye-bye and tschüss.